Hello and welcome to this episode of Bring Your Product Idea to Life. Today I have not one but two guests. Dr. Mark Mitchnick is the founder of Burnd, the high-performance sun and skincare brand. He's a paediatrician, physician scientist and serial entrepreneur. He actually invented transparent zinc oxide, which is the ingredient that makes mineral sunscreen wearable. Also joining us is his son, Malachy Mitchnick. Malachy is the co-founder and CEO of Burnd, and in startup world, CEO stands for Chief Everything Officer. So if it needs doing, it's probably on his list. I had a really great conversation with Mark and Malachy about how their product was invented years and years before it actually became a brand. The decision to go into business together, and we also talk about lots of myths and misinformation in the skincare industry, which is really interesting and like a really fascinating part of the discussion. So I think this is definitely one that you will enjoy. Whether you're interested in the world of skincare or startups or product development, there's a lot to be taken from this episode. So I would love now to introduce you to Mark and Malachy Mitchnick. So hi, Mark and Malachy. Welcome to Bring Your Product Idea to Life, and thank you so much for being here. Can we please start with you giving an introduction to yourselves, your business, and what you sell?
Sure. So I'll go first. So I'm Mark Mitchnick. I'm a physician by training, a pediatrician, and co-founder of Burnd, which is a company that is marketing skincare products, starting with sunscreens. My background, like I said, I'm a doc. I've been developing pharmaceutical products for a long time, maybe 30 years. I can't name them by name, but many of the products that you'll see on the market came through a company that I owned called Particle Sciences, where we never marketed our own product. We developed them for other folks. So my lane, my skill set is really around product development.
Brilliant,
Hi,
thank you.
my name is Malachy Mitchnick. I'm a son of Mark. Um, I'm the CEO of Burnd, and many of which Mark said as it relates to what Burnd does is exactly what we do. My background is in technology, actually. I was a software engineer at an AI company before starting a sunscreen company. And outside of that, I surf a lot.
Brilliant. Thank you both. So, Mark, I'm going to start with something I read about you when I was doing a bit of research for this episode. So, before Burnd even existed, you invented transparent zinc oxide. I believe that's the right term.
Yeah.
Can you take us back then and explain the problem you were trying to solve? Because I think this is probably an important part of the story.
Yeah. So that company was called SunSmart. And the problem I was originally trying to solve had absolutely nothing to do with zinc oxide. It was started by my brother and I, and we had a product idea, which I won't torture you with, but that idea turned out to be like a profoundly bad idea, and we would have gone broke pursuing it. But in the process of learning about that, um, I learned that from my co-inventor on the patents, actually, that zinc oxide, the white stuff everybody puts on their face, is naturally transparent. And the reason it's white is because of the way it's made. And the other thing I learned is that to make it transparent, it costs at that time maybe 100,000 US dollars a gram. So it was super expensive. It was used only in very specialized applications. My partner at the time used it to coat solar cells that they were making for the military, that kind of thing. Um, so what we did, we figured out how to manufacture it inexpensively. But having learned that that was the case, that it could be transparent, it occurred to me as I was seeing kids at that point. I practiced medicine as a pediatrician. We live in a town called East Hampton, which is a vacation town. So hundreds of thousands of people out here for the summer. Everybody was getting burned. Parents had a real hard time getting their kids to wear sunscreen and getting themselves to wear sunscreen. And so there was a mismatch, right? There was a huge need, but there really weren't elegant sunscreens that worked really well, that didn't feel really bad to put on. And so, having learned about transparent zinc oxide, and then also learning that zinc oxide is naturally a great UVB and UVA sunscreen, um, pieces kind of just fell together.
Yeah, thank you. And you mentioned earlier that you were supplying some major brands. But another thing that I read about was that you say you couldn't find a sunscreen that you trusted for your own family. So, with the products already on the market, what did you feel was missing at that time?
Yeah. So we, we manufactured the zinc oxide, um, and then we did something to it after it was manufactured to make it easier to formulate. But I had a lab of folks that really knew how to use it. In fact, we would teach the other companies how to use it because it was a brand new ingredient. It's pretty common in that world that you have an ingredient nobody knows how to use, so you set up what's called an applications lab. And even the big boys, shouldn't even name them, but all the big companies you've heard of, both in Europe and the U.S., would come to us and say, "Hey, we want to put this in our existing moisturizer or something. What's the best way to do that?" And then we would prototype formulas for them, and they would go and use it. But it was not the cheapest ingredient. Like I said, it wasn't the easiest thing to use, um, and so those companies, by and large, they're in business to make money and make as much money as they can, and so they won't spend an extra couple pennies per jar, and it really is a couple pennies per jar. It's instead of 15 cents an ounce, it might cost 18 cents an ounce or something. When you're selling 100 million jars, that's a big number. And so what we did was didn't ignore cost, but said let's start with what's the best product we can actually make that, and then say, can we afford to make that? And the answer is yes. So it's a combination of formulation skill. It's a combination of being a little less price sensitive than mass market companies are. Um, and then it's really understanding the ingredient, because we lived with the ingredient more than virtually anybody. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Yeah. So, with the things that were sort of missing from the existing products, was it mainly just down to how they were formulated rather than anything else?
Yeah, I mean, so if you look at a good sunscreen, maybe 20% of it is the actual sunscreen itself. 80% of it is the other stuff, the excipients, the inactive ingredients. And they are largely responsible for how something feels, how it dries down, how long it lasts. Um, that's not 100% true, but it's largely true. Some of the sunscreens, they're meant to be dissolved, not zinc oxide, but the organic or the chemical sunscreens. And some of them are hard to dissolve, and so you've got to add a bunch of oil or something to get them to dissolve. So sometimes the sunscreen drives what else is in the formula. But by and large, the formulator's got a wide range of things that they can use. And
Yeah,
it's
that makes sense.
that's the difference between Shiseido and the cheapest thing at Boots, right? I mean, it's the other stuff in there.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, like, whether it's easy to apply, whether it like absorbs in your skin quickly, whether it leaves a chalky film. I guess it's all that
Yep.
kind of thing.
Yeah, and how it feels. Of course, packaging is a whole other thing.
Of
But
course, yeah.
the formulation can be. Sunscreens are drugs in the U.S., in Europe, and Asia, and so we all have a limited number of actual sunscreen chemicals we can use to block the sun, but we've got a ton of other stuff we can put in there to make it feel better, last longer, etc.
And
Yeah,
Vicky, to answer your question directly, and Dad, step in here if you disagree with any of this, but your question was around there's stuff out there, so why make something for yourself? And it really sort of blends down to the formulation. So, the example that I use or that I think about is I was a little kid. I was running around, jumping in the ocean. My mom is a super fair skinned Irish woman. And yes, there are sunscreens out there, and there's still a bunch of good sunscreens out there today that will do the core job of protecting you. But they're either inelegant to use, and so they have all the common problems that people describe of them rubbing into your eyes, staining your clothes, just feeling gross, or they don't really work that well in athletic contexts. And for us, and specifically for my family, that meant being able to go to the beach and surf, boogie board, go in the water, and your kid not turn into sort of a little sand magnet, or it just disintegrates the moment you get into the water. And that really just leads to a compliance issue. With the thing about sunscreens, whether it's for a 5-year-old or a 30-year-old, is that if you don't use it, it's not going to work. and people don't use sunscreens because they don't actually enjoy using them. And the goal isn't necessarily to create something that people wake up in the morning and they're super excited to use. I think that's a little bit of a big ask for people around sunscreen.
Mm.
But it's simply making something that works and actually defining working by it's not gross, it doesn't stink to use. And so that when people do know that they need it, which everyone knows that they should wear sunscreen, they're not sort of looking for any and all excuse of it's in the car, I forgot it, I'm only going out for 20 minutes. Whatever excuse you can make in your brain not to use something that you know you should use. The invention or the change that Mark was looking for was just to make something that my mom and I didn't hate wearing.
Yeah. Thank you so much for like distilling that. That's really interesting. And I completely know what you mean, because I think a lot of us, there are products we wear daily, whether it's deodorant or it's a moisturizer, whatever it is. But if you get the wrong sunscreen, you're right. It's not pleasant to put on. Kids in particular, they make a huge fuss about having to apply their sunscreen. I've got 2 kids, neither of them like wearing sunscreen. It makes a big difference, but of course it's vital because it's so important to our health.
And so, I mean, so within the realm of skincare products, whether it be a moisturizer, deodorant, I mean, a cologne, even, all of those are to a degree optional. You know, you don't use
Yeah.
deodorant, you might smell bad. You don't use a moisturizer, your skin might be a little tight. Um, Sunscreen is a different category entirely. I mean, there's the skin cancer element of it, which is obviously a massive reason to use it, and then there's the photo aging piece of it. And this is something that we talk about all the time in the company, where we don't actually mind if people use sunscreen just because they don't want to look old. Like, vanity is an extremely powerful motivator for people. Nonetheless, if something is just unenjoyable to use, you're not going to use it. And that's just basic human tendency. And so within the conversation of sunscreen, and particularly around Mark's invention and the impetus to formulate one for his family, it was as much about, I just want to make something that they won't hate using, and I can't find that, as it is about, I needed to work better by the traditional metrics of just protecting them from the sun.
That makes sense. Thank you. So, Mark, you mentioned that you spent years in product development. In your opinion, what's the difference between making something that's genuinely innovative versus making another version of something that's already exists?
Um, uh, so I guess the first thing I want to say is it's not easy to knock stuff off. And so the notion that I'm just going to copy what those guys did, it'll be a breeze. That's crazy. In the extreme in pharmaceuticals, you have generics and you have the branded products. Um, it'll take a generic company sometimes 10 years to figure out exactly how to knock off, how to duplicate the branded product. And so I guess that's not answering your question, but one thing it's not is it's not a whole lot easier just copying people, right? Copying is hard, especially in a regulated industry where you can't come close. You have to be exactly the same thing. Um, and that is just not easily done. So aside from the obvious that, first you have to have an idea to innovate. Um, uh, you also, I think, need to have a lot of self-belief, because innovations are very often not viewed as great ideas other than by the people that have them. And so you've got to go, if you need money, you've got to go convince people that it's worth spending money on. You often have to develop, in these kinds of endeavors, different manufacturing processes, so that there's a lot more of the peripheral stuff that doesn't exist that you have to go put in place. But probably the biggest one is just being so convinced that your idea is good that you proceed, um, despite a lot of evidence to the contrary. So, I
Yeah,
would say that, I've started and sold 4 companies, and each one of those was based on an idea that I was told was a pretty bad idea.
that's really interesting because you also hear advice that you have to do market research and you have to find out if there's a market for your product. So I guess it's knowing when to persist and knowing like when you genuinely have a really good, useful product idea, isn't it?
I don't know if
Yeah,
it,
and you're gonna sorry, Mook,
yeah.
you're gonna be wrong a bunch of times. Like, a lot of times the people telling you it's a bad idea, they're right. It is a bad idea. Like I said, the first time my brother and I started, we thought it was a fantastic idea, and it was not. Um, it's, um, but if you really think something's good, I guess it was Henry Ford, if you ask people what they need, they would have said a faster horse. Um, and so, there's a certain amount of arrogance there. Um, and I don't think there's a magic formula to knowing when you're right and when others are wrong. It's just you've got to stick with it long enough to give it a chance.
Yeah, I guess that's experience, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it's experience and to whatever degree, just blind confidence in yourself. I mean, like the example that I would use here is saying you want to start a sunscreen company um, has about as high likelihood of success as saying you want to start a car company. There are companies that have been around for 100 years who are doing billions and billions and billions of dollars for the business, and particularly the way that we market, which is a paid marketing approach. There are companies who every day spend more than our annual budget. And so this idea of, I want to go start a sunscreen company, the majority of people who I told that to, whilst getting this off the ground, I mean, even now say, well, how do you plan on beating Shiseido or Banana Boat or any of the massive companies? And if I had an answer that was, well, I don't know, but I'm going to have to figure it out, then that's just not true. Like that's not a truthful way to respond to the question, because the real answer is, we had no idea. The reality is we had a product or I had a product at that point that I just knew was better than anything I could buy. There was a story there, but nothing about that seemed like a good idea. And so
Financially.
yeah, financially, or for me being 28 years old, never having started a company before, was this really the best way for me to sink a couple of years of my time into at a point in which many of my peers are doing the thing that sets them up for their career, whether that's in whatever career, that banking or finance or whatever it may be. The thing you do now kind of determines the thing you're going to do for the next 15, 20 years. And starting this wasn't exactly the best possible thing I could do for my future. But getting back to Mark's point, it's if you think you have a good idea, uh, you just kind of have to pursue it blindly until someone else thinks it's a good idea. And enough people think it's a good idea to where you either have a company or you don't.
Yeah, thank you. And I would really love to know, so with all that said, what was it that made you think, okay, we have a good idea, let's start a sun cream company?
You want to take this one, Dad? I think we'll have very different answers.
Um, yeah. So, from my view, we knew the product was really good. Right. And I know from experience that we could make similar products in a cleanser and a moisturizer, in other skincare products. We're sunscreen central, sunscreen focused. Um, but it's hard to make a company just off of sunscreen. You've got to have all the other products, and could you actually differentiate on performance? Um, and so, that's what we knew. We can differentiate on performance. What we didn't know is could we rise above the noise on marketing? Because there are countless good ideas that never see the light of day, because of inadequate marketing and inadequate funding. You name it. So that was the thing neither Malachy nor I had experience in. But we found a guy, you know, and brought in that expertise.
And
How about you, Malachy? Do you have a different answer for that?
yeah, I mean, so not necessarily different, but to add on to that, what was so I was living in Costa Rica. At the point, I was sort of tapping away on a computer, working in a tech company, and I had tried every sunscreen that I could buy. I mean, obviously, I have a lot of surface area to cover, and there was nothing that I could buy did the job or did the job as well as the product that I knew my dad had made. And so it wasn't so much a question as to whether this is a good sunscreen. It was again back to that question of is this a good idea to pursue? Is anyone going to care? And the first sort of glimmer of hope I had was when we actually made the first batch, and I gave it to a bunch of people who, sure, they liked me, but there was absolutely no reason for them to say I like this other than them actually using it and liking it. And I don't know how much time you or your listeners have spent in Central America, but it is a terrific environment to test a sunscreen in. I mean, especially for people that aren't native to that region. And so the first sort of initial round of feedback, was, where can I buy this? This is a good sunscreen. This is different than any sunscreen I'd ever tried. That was sort of the first time that I thought, this might actually be a good idea. But also starting a company with my dad, I mean, I've seen him do well for himself. I've seen him be a good leader, and I've seen him grow things successfully. And so, part of the hubris of thinking that I could pull this off was certainly the fact that, I have him sort of in my corner and actively involved in this. And so that wasn't necessarily saying it was going to work, but it was minimizing the chance of failure. And so for me, it was a combination of people actually liking what we made, which is always a good thing. And then just being able to work with Mark, that gave me probably more confidence than I deserved at the time.
Oh, thank you both. And I'd love to know a little bit more about how you actually went about launching. So, what were some of the steps that you took from deciding, okay, this is going to be a brand, we're going to give it a go, to actually having a product on the market?
I mean, there's the basic mechanics of starting a company. Everyone knows this. You brand the name, you start a bank account, you build a website, all those sort of nuts and bolts. But I think more so to the idea of a startup not knowing if it's a good idea. It was a side project for a while. And so at the time, I was still doing other things professionally. And this is really in the beginning of the company, call it the first 6 or 8 months. Mark was definitely still doing other things professionally, and he's still doing other things now. He's just lucky to have his time. But it was a gradual sort of, all right, we think this could work, to, all right, we have some data over the summer that people are into the idea, they're into the brand, they like the product. And then there does come a point of which it's kind of a light switch in terms of like, all right, if we do this, then X, Y, and Z has to happen. And that means, going out and raising external money. That means devoting all of your time to something. It's really about choosing to take that risk as opposed to having a backup plan. And so to directly answer your question, starting this company was as much about doing the blocking and tackling of the mechanics of any business. But the real unlock there was just, all right, there is no plan B. Like, this has to work. And that was a gradual process, as opposed to, from one day to the next.
That's brilliant. Thank you. So, your mission talks about building a small system of products rather than having a huge range. Can you talk a little bit about why that was important to you? Because you mentioned earlier that you could put this formulation into all kinds of products.
Sure. Oh, you were going to say something, Dad.
Yeah, so it's important to us because we think it should be important, or is important to the customer base that we want to establish, to our little tribe, so to speak. And the reality in skincare, and this is not going to be true universally for other industries, but there's actually just a handful of stuff that actually does anything, and the rest of it is marketing nonsense. And I say that, and I can walk 60 feet that way, and go and on my wife's shelves, and there's more there in cost than I made my first year out of medical school, right? So you can know something, and then you can actually believe and act on something. But the reality is, the single most important thing anybody knew for their skin is not overdo it in the sun. Right. And it's probably the most widely agreed upon medical fact on the planet. And sure, there's all kinds of, TikTok folks out there saying, get burned, it's good for you, all this kind of stuff. But it's not, it's scientific nonsense. And then there are things like, the retinol and vitamin C in some cases, but there's literally just a handful. So the notion that somebody needs, or a company needs 50 or 60 products, um, just isn't true. It complicates things a great deal for people. And so, we want to be a company people look to and say, hey, you've only got 4 products. Why? And there's only 4 things that have actually been shown to do anything for you. And so here are our versions of those 4 things. And sure, it might end up being 10 or 12 or something, but it's never going to be 100. If we need another one, it'll probably be that we found a better version of something we're already doing. So that's part of the value add there. This stuff is really complicated. It's made much more complicated than it needs to be. So what can we do? We can simplify it for folks. We can, over time, get them to trust that we're doing the hard work. If your car breaks down, when I was a kid, we would go fix it, right? That's no longer the case. I wouldn't even know how to fix my car right now. And so I trust the dealer. I trust the mechanic that he or she has done their homework. They know what they're doing. And so skincare almost needs to be the same thing.
So that's the sort of practical answer to it, and then there's the brand answer to it, which is, and this ties into why we thought this was a good idea, which was, I don't think I'm unique in both my demographic and then also just in my sentiment around the fact that there's just too much stuff out there to buy. And so for me, it's part of the reason I started the company, which was, if my dad is literally the guy that invented the thing and I don't know what to buy, there's something wrong there. And so this idea of complexity, not in terms of the science of a formulation or the efficacy of a product, but just in terms of the number of choices that I have, that was just something that we just didn't want to involve in our own company. And so it's both myself and it's my co-founder, John, and Mark for that matter. Whereas just, we know the science, and the science doesn't suggest that you need more than a couple of things. And then also just in terms of the brand that any of us can feel good about, we don't want to make a bunch of things for people to buy that they don't need.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And I'll be honest as well, as a consumer, it could be really confusing. I'm not going to name brands, but there's a brand here in the UK, I'm sure they're in the US as well, that I like for skincare. And when they have a choice of 10 different moisturizers, as an example, it's really hard to know which is the right one. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's
it's hard.
It's confusing and it's disingenuous, and the other thing is, like, it's not easy to make this stuff, and so we don't really have the bandwidth to make a bunch of crap. But
yeah, it's also, even from their perspective, at some point counterproductive. So there's a great book called Paradox of Choice. And humans are not, we get paralyzed at some point. And so, a good example, you walk into the grocery store and they're giving away free cheese, so you try the cheese and, hopefully buy some. If there's a choice of 2 or 3 cheeses, I'm going to make up a number here. 30% of the people might buy something. If there's 15 of them, that goes close to zero. It's too many choices. I can't make one, and so I'm gonna walk away and not buy any cheese. And so it's also it's in the consumer's best interest. It's also in our best interest, we believe, to keep things simple.
I think so. And I really resonate with that example. The amount of times I've walked away from somewhere because it's just too much to make a
Yeah.
decision.
Yeah, it's like, I don't really need cheese, so I'm not going to spend 10 minutes thinking about it.
So something else that stood out for me is your position against fear-based marketing. And I just thought it would be interesting to talk about that a bit as well, because that's something we do often see, particularly in the skincare space. So I'm really interested just to talk that through a bit.
Yeah, so I'm sure Mac will have his version of this, but it goes back to something more basic. Is you shouldn't treat people like morons. because the vast majority of people are not. And trying to scare them is treating them like they're not smart enough to understand the truth if you present it to them. And it's just too easy to get people's attention by saying, that company's going to kill you, or this company is doing this, or you name it. And it's our view, and I think we've proven this, and as have many other companies, that there's value, and you can develop loyalty and a following just by telling, I don't even want to say the truth, because that makes it sound like there's some big conspiracy out there, but just by communicating clearly. And like I said, the science is pretty complicated, but the basic idea is not. UV bad, skin cancer bad, premature aging not great, sunscreen good, right? I mean, there's and you can dive a lot deeper than that, but that's the basic message.
Yeah, I'm with you. And I also agree that people, the majority of people, they're not stupid. However, I think all of us appreciate
Right.
things being made simple for us. So
Yeah,
like you
and
said, like that simple messaging does work, because we all appreciate being told things sort of in a simple, straightforward way we can understand,
yeah, I
without
mean,
the fear and the emotion.
yeah, people confuse uneducated with being stupid. And nobody can possibly be educated in everything. I'm a pediatrician. I have friends who come to me and say, "Hey, what do you think about this high blood pressure medicine?" I have no idea. Kids don't get high blood pressure, right? And so 40 years ago, a doc could know, pretty much everything in medicine. That's just not the case anymore. You have to specialize and specialize and specialize. And so to expect, and the big companies don't expect consumers to know a lot about skincare, really. But rather than try and teach them what they need to know, it's easier just to scare them, or frankly, just lie to them to get them to purchase their product. So, obviously that works. There are people making billions of dollars doing that. But it's our business plan that there's enough folks out there that our approach will appeal to.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, and I have a slightly more aggravated view of this than Mark does. But I mean, there's my view comes of this from probably me being 28 and living on social media a hell of a lot more than Mark does. Although he does have an Instagram account now, and we do DM, so he's he's entered the world of social media. But the reality is, and I know this well for sunscreen. I don't know this well for other skincare verticals. But sunscreen is one of those things of which the contemporary buying mechanism is to convince someone that this ingredient or this formulation or this category of ingredients is going to kill you or is bad for you. So go buy our thing. And first and foremost, and this comes from before I started a company or a CPG company, which is just that if someone has to tell me that the other guy's stuff is going to kill them or kill them, so buy my stuff, probably not going to trust them. Because to me, at least, that's not that's not a trustworthy place to start. But then the other piece of this is fear-based marketing leads to people either not wearing sunscreen or just not going outside. And so this idea of like, if you use a chemical sunscreen, it's going to be an endocrine disruptor and mess up your hormones, cause skin cancer. Sunscreen actually causes skin cancer, so don't use it. All of this just leads to a place that I think is fundamentally bad for people. And so the reaction that we have to fear-based marketing isn't even necessarily that we think it's goofy, although we do. It's that the consequences of that, specifically for the products that we make, are in many cases not necessarily life and death. It's not like everyone who gets sunburn is going to get skin cancer, but my mom had melanoma twice. I have friends whose parents or grandparents have died from melanoma or just been maimed from it. Getting a big chunk of your face taken off is not a good option either. And so if the early behavior is shaped by something that is just blatantly wrong, and it's so easy to avoid, it sort of goes past what makes money or is good marketing tendencies, but what is just morally right. Like, what are the ethics of marketing to someone when what you sell them has a tangible effect on what they're going to be able to do with their kids 30 or 40 years later? And it's not ridiculous to say that sunscreen fits into that category. And so there's the ethical piece of it. There's the fact that it's short lived. Like, I can tell you from a data perspective that if you want to build a company that lasts, doing it exclusively off the fact that everyone else sucks isn't really a good business plan. And then lastly, it's that trust piece, which is fundamental to this business. I mean, the reason that people, at least right now from the marketing that we're doing, are buying Burnd and trusting it is because it was made because a parent was trying to solve a problem. That's sort of fundamental story, which is our story. And so mixing that message with, like, buy this and your life's going to be ruined, those two things can't really sit in the same room together.
Yeah, and here's I realize it's not a science podcast or a health and wellness podcast, but it's a really good example of trying to make things easy for consumers. So the data that controlling UV exposure is will mitigate a lot of photo aging is solid, right? That's just known. And 80% of the stuff that happens to your skin visibly as you get older is because of sun exposure, right? The fact that wearing sunscreens will drastically cut down on precancerous lesions and 2 kinds of the 3 kinds of cancer is really well documented. It's not so clear that wearing sunscreens will help with melanoma. It probably is true, but it's actually not crystal clear like it is with some other things. And there's lots of reasons for that. Primarily, or one of the big reasons, it's really hard to study because it's a really long-term thing. So you've got to rely on people's reports of what they used to do for sunscreens. And humans are really, really, really crappy historians. Like we really don't recall what we did very well. So I don't want to like go down that rabbit hole, but how do you convey that clearly to consumers when people call say, hey, will this prevent this or that? We'll say, we don't know. Here's what the sign says. It's not going to do any harm. Personally, I'm wearing sunscreen. But you go figure that out for yourself. So just a little tangent there.
No, thank you for that. And I think coming back to what you were saying, Malachy, I agree with you about your story. I think consumers now are more interested in the story behind a brand, and that you have a personal reason for starting this business. And I think people are genuinely interested in that. And I imagine that's much more effective than saying, if you don't use our product, these terrible things will happen, or could happen. Because yes, okay, that there are risks for not wearing sunscreen, but I do think that having a personal story behind the brand helps customers connect with you a bit more. Was that your experience?
Yeah, and it specifically within context of this conversation and bringing a product to market. And this is a perfect way of explaining whatever degree of success that we've had and will hopefully continue to have, which is there is a bunch of sunscreens out there. There's a bunch of sunscreens that use fear-based marketing. And so purely looking at what is a differentiator that we can talk about confidently, for us, it's that story. And so we're in the lucky position that the ethics for us line up with what we think is actually a good marketing strategy. And to your question, so if a very good friend of mine, who's sort of a mentor of mine, who's been critically involved in bringing some of the largest brands, largest tech companies in the world to scale. When I was asking him about Burnd in the very beginning, I was explaining to him the science, and I was trying to create the brand that not necessarily that I think he would want to hear, but just explain it in such a way as to someone of his caliber would understand. And he was like, just talk to me like we're catching up at a bar. Like, I just asked you what you're up to. And explaining that to someone in I don't want to use the word pedestrian, but in an actual human way, as opposed to something that is architected or constructed to sound good. That's what we've seen be the big unlock for us. And so what I've seen in terms of consumer behavior is, me sitting there saying, I started this phenomenal sunscreen company that uses microparticles zinc oxide, and we make the best product, like the sort of TV commercials with like OxySeal or Flex Seal or something. That doesn't work. Frankly, no one cares. Sitting there and saying, I remember what it was like for my mom and dad to tell me that mom's sick when I was 10 years old. Now I come to understand that that was melanoma. Talking about the fact that when I was growing up, I had cystic acne. And so, using a sunscreen that wasn't meant for sensitive skin, or that was not comedogenic, had negative impacts on me, because then I would be choosing whether or not to wear sunscreen or have new pimples when I went on a date later that week. All of that is there's no way to make that up because no one's going to think like that's actually what happened. And so using that to explain why my product is worth trying out, not even necessarily better, but just worth trying because maybe that's a story that, fits into your life in some way. That has been, not only in terms of data, but just in terms of anecdotally having conversations with people, the absolute best way to talk about Burnd. It's this isn't a new idea. Simon Sinek, who many of your listeners or yourself may be familiar with, he's a very famous marketer. He talks about the difference between Microsoft and Apple. And fundamentally, Microsoft just told people why their motherboard was better than other computers. And Apple told you a story about what you could do with their computer. And yes, my dad's using a Microsoft computer right now. I'm using an Apple computer. They're still big companies, but there's an obvious difference in those brands and how they've scaled and the sort of cultural relevance that they have. And so the simplest way to answer your question is we would not have a company unless we told our story.
Thank you. Absolutely, I agree because, like like we said right at the beginning, you're not the only sun care brand out there. There are others, and I
Yeah.
think I think differentiating on the product is one thing, but I think it's a lot easier to differentiate by sharing your story because nobody else has your story.
Yeah, and I think founders, in my experience with founders, specifically young ones who haven't done this before, there's a lot of imposter syndrome. Like when I started this company, I thought, who cares about me? Who cares about my story? I was shy to tell that because I had something that I thought was a better product and there's science behind it. And, my dad is this formulation wizard, and my co-founder is this extremely successful marketer. And on paper, they're a lot more successful than I am, or at least there's better reason for people to care what they say. And so for me, it was, sure, I can tell you why I did this, but I don't know why anyone would care. What that's evolved into is the only reason, or the majority of the reason why people care is the why behind it. And so, yes, Mark did all these things that are impressive, and he's smart and blah, blah, blah. I can see you laughing there, Dad. But fundamentally, a parent trying to solve a problem, and then a kid growing up watching, mom suffering from something and not wanting other moms to be in the same position, at least as an entry point, specifically as it relates to bringing a product to market, that just matters more. And then you have to have a good product, and you have to have good marketing, and you have to have good distribution, and all those core mechanics of a good business. It doesn't replace that. But it matters more. At least I think so in this day and age.
I think
So
so
Vicky,
too.
I mean, you got another job, right? You help companies market, correct?
I help brand sales specifically on Amazon. Yes.
Yeah. And so what I'm not sure if you do this in your podcast, but what's your experience? Have which would you rather have, a great product or a great story?
I'll be honest, both is
Yeah.
ideal.
Yeah.
But the story is really important. And when I
Yeah.
work with brands on Amazon, one of the things that I'm always keen that they talk about in their listings and in their store is their story, because everybody is going to say, this, if we're still talking about, let's say skincare, everyone's going to say our formulation's great, our formulation's the best,
Yeah, of
because you,
course.
you would say that, right?
Right.
But I think when you have a story about a founder who's, they've got a reason for creating the brand, um, or maybe some of the brands that I've worked with, for example, have a real strong angle on sustainability or ethics, and there's different things that they do in their businesses that may be different to the way other people are doing it because of their personal experience. It's just something that helps people connect with the brands a little bit more, and it makes it more memorable as well. That's the other thing. Like, I think people will remember Burnd because they'll remember the story. Whereas if you came on this podcast, for example, and you were just talking about your formulation and this is the best and this is what it does, that's a lot less memorable. But when people talk to me about episodes that I've done in the past, they will often say, "Oh, the episode with the lady who did this, or the person who," they remember the brand, but they also remember the person behind it as well. And I think that creates a bit more connection. And as I say, makes you more memorable. And coming back to the question you asked about Amazon, on a marketplace like that, you need to stand out, and people do need to remember you because you're not going to be the only one selling that moisturizer, that sun cream, whatever it is. There
No, I
are
mean,
going to be other people.
We are painfully aware of that.
yeah. In fact, I could tell you for a fact there are 75,000 other sunscreens on Amazon.
Wow.
Yeah, no, it's not exactly an uncrowded marketplace.
Yeah, and that's the same whatever you sell. So yeah, I'm a big fan of talking about stories. And actually, that's part of the reason I know we're digressing a little bit, for doing this podcast, because I think it's important for brands to get their stories out there and for people to hear them.
Yeah, so thank you.
Well, you're welcome. Well, thank you. Now, I'm aware I'm taking lots of your time, but have we got time for a few more questions before we finish up?
Yeah.
Sure.
So we've been talking a lot about marketing and how different people approach marketing. I'd love your advice to my listeners for people who genuinely want to make better decisions. Is there a way they can tell the difference between evidence-backed advice or brands who just simply sound convincing?
There are some good rules of thumb. The first, I would say, TikTok cannot be your primary source of information. And I'm not exaggerating. 9 out of 10 people talking about sunscreens or skincare on TikTok are actually wrong. It's not even that they're just shilling for a brand; they're actually wrong. And so that, if you see something on social media or anywhere for that matter, and you want it to be true, do a little bit of homework and find out if it is true. And with GPT and Claude and all the LLMs right now, it is easier than it's ever been. You literally ask the question, and it'll give you a pretty darn good answer if you don't know a doc or someone who actually is in that industry to go ask. So that's a major thing. And the other is the old saying: if it's too good to be true, it probably is. Right. So if somebody for $63 wants to sell you something that's going to take the 67-year-old guy who's been in the sun his whole life and make me look like I'm 30 in 3 weeks, that's just not going to happen. Right? Surgery is not even going to do that, let alone some sort of skin cream. So I think a little common sense, and then ultimately, and this is what we're trying to do with Burn, spend some time with a brand, with a group of people, decide that you can trust what they say, and then you can sort of outsource, that topic to them. So, I've done this. There are topics I'm super interested in, have just no prayer in hell of ever becoming an expert in, especially, at this point in my life. And so I've outsourced it. I found a couple of people that I know just spend their day, in that arena. And for the most part, I listen to what they say and I say, okay, that's probably true. And if something I'm questioning, I can go do a little homework. So, don't try to be an expert in all things. Find something you trust, and look at, if not great sources, at least look at a few sources. And then realize that influencers just get paid to say shit. Right? that there's just no honesty or truth in what they're saying.
The The other filter that I have, and honestly, I didn't know this until I started a company. Just email them. Like if someone responds to what you're saying or the question that you have, um, there's likely a human there, and if there's a human there, there's probably humans elsewhere. And so that sounds like a really simple answer, but like, the best example with our sunscreen is I get questions all the time around what the ingredients are. So I do all the customer service. Um, and if you ask, does your product, does your sunscreen, does your wing foil board, whatever it is, have this or do this? And someone, an automated response tells you to go read the help documentation of the FAQs, probably not the best people to trust. And that's not a steadfast rule. Like, there are obviously bigger companies will trouble customer service, but for any of your listeners trying to decide whether or not to trust a product, just email the company and ask to hop on the phone with them. I mean, I get on the phone with customers all the time, and answer their questions. And sometimes the answer to the question is we don't do the thing that you're asking us to do, or we have an ingredient that you're hoping that we don't have. If you ask someone a question and they either evade the answer, don't answer at all, or refuse to work with you to find a solution, probably not the best thing to put in your body or put in your skin. And I find that to be a really good filter, especially with smaller companies, because if they don't care to answer your email, they probably don't care what they're putting in their products.
That's great advice. Thank you. And you're right. It's something very simple. However, a lot of us don't do that. So
No,
thank
and,
you.
and, and you can DM them. Like I at this point, I'm intimately familiar with this world of customer service, but um, DM them, comment on their Facebook posts, comment on their Instagram posts, ask questions. I mean, in active one, it's table stakes now, what I think for any good brand. But it's also a way of checking as to whether they care what people actually say about them. Because the reality is, like, you can pay 1,000 influencers to say good things. You can pay 1,000 people to go write reviews on your products. The social proof, albeit useful, is not uh, gospel. Um, Interacting with a company, even your product getting lost in shipping and having them ship you a new one. I mean, all these sort of touch points of, like, they actually care about their customer after they buy something once. That is, I think that, in my opinion, at least, the best way to delineate whether or not a science-backed company is legit.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. You're right. And I think how a company treats you as a customer says a lot about them. And yeah, you can definitely glean a lot from how they interact with you and how they deal with issues.
Mhm.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, well, I've got one final question before we finish up, if that's okay.
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask if you can both answer this, if you don't mind. So, as you know, this podcast is, my target audience is other people who run product-based businesses or are looking to start one. And I would love for you to let me know what your number one piece of advice would be for other product brands.
Father?
I was going to tell you to go first. Um, the number one piece of advice, product ranks. Yeah. So I would say start with the product. In other words, um, yeah, you know, and you can't force this, right? So it's just got to happen naturally in your life. Have an idea of something that needs to be out there, um, and that you're really interested in, because this is way too hard and way too expensive and way too likely to fail to do it if you're not interested. Um, and then go after it. I think if you're the reverse is hard to do and much less productive. If, say, I want to be in consumer product goods, what's a good one? What should I try? I think, and I'm sure there are people who succeed wildly doing that. I don't know them. It's certainly not me. But I would think that would be a lot harder, because this is just way too hard um, to do, unless you're, like, actually interested in the thing that you're doing.
Yeah, the short way to say what Mark just said is it sucks 99% of the time. So make sure you actually enjoy doing it, because if you don't, you're not going to succeed. I guess my piece of advice would be in a way similar to that, which is, so we've been around for about a year. We've had the idea for about a year and a half, and actually had product to market in a year. And we are just now getting enough data to make a data-informed decision. And the reality is we still don't have a lot of what we need. And so the piece of advice that I would give it is be comfortable making decisions without the data to support them, and make a decision and follow through with that, and don't stop until you have the data. And whether or not that was a good decision or not, you'll end up seeing. But the reality with starting a company, and I think this was a misnomer for me, which is, now that we have all of these tools, and you hear performance marketers talking about your return on ad spend and your click-through rates and your website metrics. There's a million one ways to get data, but the reality is that the decisions that you're making in the beginning, you don't have them. And so trying to get caught up in getting the data, you waste the time of going and actually doing the thing. And for me, at least, that was a really helpful insight, which is just, making decisions that I don't have the data to support and sticking with them.
Yeah. And let me give you a second. Assuming that you're not raising millions and millions of dollars to start out with, really good ideas, even really good ideas, take a while for the world to get around to. And so you have to make sure that you can last long enough for the idea, assuming it's a good one, to get some adoption. All right. And so you've got a P and an L, right? And the P is really hard to guess and control, but you can control the L. So it's going to be there, but you can control the slope of it. So stay as lean as you can. That's a lot easier now than it was 10 years ago. Again, just the software available to people now. We started Burn on probably 50,000-60,000 US less in legal expenses than it would have cost me 10 years ago. Just because the amount you can do yourself now. And so spend money on the important stuff, stay virtual. He's in our living room right now.
Yeah, talking about staying lean, because I'm living at home because we don't have enough money to pay me.
He's thrilled about that. 28-year-old living at home right now.
No, it's there's the glamorous side of things for TikTok and Instagram, and then there is the reality, which is, I'm very happy that I'm doing this, but it sucks a lot of the time, and so you have to make the sacrifices. If you don't, unless there's a benefactor behind you that'll just give you millions of dollars to figure stuff out, you're not going to make it.
And a ton of money ain't necessarily the best thing.
Yeah,
you get stupid if you have too much money. So
thank you for all of that. And I think also just wanted to say, Malachy, I think it's also really important that you've highlighted, you said that it's a year on and you're living at home. I think that's also important for people to hear, because there's also expectations that by this point I will be here, by this point I'll be paying myself this much, by this point, do you know what I mean? I think that is something that people genuinely think. And so I think it's important for people to hear that actually a year on you can be doing well, but there were still sacrifices that need to be made, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I think that's important for people to appreciate.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm every parent's dream right now. Living in the guest bedroom, sapping resources as an adult.
That is.
No,
I dreamt forever of this, of you still being here 28 years later.
At least I moved back in. I didn't stay. But no, as a conclusory note, Vicky, to your point, there's there's TikTok scientists and there's TikTok success stories, and obviously that is a way of framing this instant success, call it culture that we have now. The reality of it, at least in my own experience, is none of this stuff is easy and it takes a long time. And so, obviously I want to do this for a million and one reasons, one of which is because I'm having more fun doing this than I ever had any job I've ever done. And like any business owner, the economics work really well if it works. But that if it works takes longer and costs more money than anyone would like to expect.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being honest about that. And thank you both for everything you've shared. This has been a brilliant conversation. Thank you so much.